Maya Thompson had worked at Rosie's Diner for 7 years, through layoffs, through heartbreak, through the kind of silence that comes when the world forgets you exist. She was 32, black, single mother to a 10-year-old boy, and invisible to most people who pass through the revolving door. But on a Tuesday afternoon, a man in an Italian suit decided to remind her exactly how invisible she was meant to be. His mockery wasn't random cruelty. It was a test of her worth, and she failed by his measure. Within hours, she was fired. Within hours more, the sound of motorcycle engines filled the parking lot like thunder answering a prayer she didn't know she'd whispered. 50 bikers rolled up to Rosie's Diner, and they weren't there for coffee. They were there because one of them, a man named Cole, who'd made a promise to his late sister, recognized something in Maya's eyes. Recognition, dignity, the kind of person worth fighting for. What started as a single act of kindness would spiral into something far larger, a reckoning with the man who'd humiliated her, a revelation about who really owned the diner, and a truth that would change everything Maya thought she knew about her place in the world. The lunch rush had ended an hour ago, leaving Maya with the pleasant hum of a half-full diner and the smell of coffee that had become as familiar as her own breath. She tied her burgundy apron tight around her waist, the one with the faded name tag that read Maya in fading white letters, and was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door chimed. The man who entered moved like someone accustomed to occupying space, Italian suit tailored to precision, Rolex catching the afternoon light. His shoes clicked against the checkered floor with the rhythm of someone who'd never worried about making noise. Behind him came 2 others in similar dress. Colleagues, Maya assumed, though she'd learned long ago not to assume much about rich men. They took the corner booth without waiting to be seated. "Coffee," the man called out, not looking at her. "Black, and bring a menu, but not that one." He gestured dismissively at the laminated paper already on the table. "Something decent." Maya felt the familiar compression in her chest, that small knot that appeared whenever someone decided to treat the diner like a stage for their importance. She poured the coffee, set it down carefully, and offered the menu they already had. "I said something decent," he repeated, this time looking at her. His eyes moved across her face like he was reading an expiration date. "You understand English?" The diner quieted. 2 other customers, regulars who'd known Maya for years, looked up from their plates. "That's our menu," Maya said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt. "Everything on it is fresh today." "I don't eat at diners," he said flatly. "I eat at places where the staff knows how to present themselves." He paused, letting his gaze travel from her face to her apron, lingering on a small coffee stain near the hem. "Apparently, that's not here." One of his companions laughed, a sharp practice sound that seemed rehearsed for exactly this moment. Maya set the menu down and walked away. She'd learned long ago that some people couldn't be reasoned with, that their cruelty wasn't about her, it was about them proving something to themselves. Still, her hands shook slightly as she poured water for another table. The man ordered a salad, then sent it back twice, once because the lettuce was wilted, once because the dressing wasn't on the side. Both times, Maya made the corrections in silence. Both times, he found new reasons to be unsatisfied. By the 3rd plate, he'd gathered an audience of his companions, and they were laughing openly at the diner, at the decor, at the very idea that anyone with standards would eat here. "You know what?" Rosie, the owner, emerged from the back kitchen, her face flushed. She was a woman in her 60s who'd built this place from nothing. "You need to leave." "I'm a paying customer," the man said, smiling like a predator. "Not anymore," Rosie replied. He stood, pulled out a credit card, and dropped it on the table. "By the way," he said, looking directly at Maya, "you should find another job. You've got maybe 5 years before you're unemployable. Might as well start now." He turned to Rosie. This place is a disgrace. I'm surprised the health department hasn't shut it down." The three men left, their laughter echoing even after the door closed. Rosie stood behind the counter, her jaw tight. Maya continued wiping tables, moving through the motions like a machine. If you're watching, you know what comes next, and you'll want to see how one act of cruelty becomes the spark for something much bigger. Don't scroll past this moment. She didn't know that the man's words had already been overheard. She didn't know that one of the customers, an older man in a worn leather jacket, had been sitting 3 booths away. She didn't know that his name was Cole, and that he'd made a promise to his dead sister that he would never let cruelty like that go unanswered. Not with violence, but with something far more powerful. By the time Maya clocked out that evening, everything was already in motion. Cole hadn't planned to be at Rosie's diner that Tuesday. He'd been riding north on Route 7, heading toward a meeting with his crew, 49 other members of the Iron Promise MC, when his bike's engine had sputtered. Nothing serious, just a warning light. He'd pulled off at the nearest exit and found himself here, in this small-town diner with its red vinyl booths and its homemade pie that tasted like someone's grandmother had made it with care. He'd ordered coffee and sat in a back booth reading the newspaper, trying to quiet the constant noise in his head. 17 years since his sister died. 17 years since she'd been dismissed, mocked, overlooked, and he hadn't been there to protect her. The guilt lived in his chest like a second heartbeat. Then the man in the suit had walked in, and Cole had recognized the type immediately. The kind of person who believed the world had arranged itself for their benefit. The kind who used words like weapons because they'd never been taught what actual weapons felt like. Cole had watched the entire exchange, the dismissal, the mockery, the way the man's companions had laughed like hyenas, and he'd watched Maya, young, black, composed despite the shaking in her hands, move through it all with a dignity that made him think of his sister. When the man had said those words, "You should find another job. You've got maybe 5 years before you're unemployable." Something in Cole had shifted, not into anger, into purpose. He'd finished his coffee, paid his bill, and walked out to his bike. The road back to the clubhouse took 40 minutes. By the time he arrived at the Iron Promise compound, a sprawling property outside the city limits, bordered by chain-link fence and surrounded by the roar of 50 engines, he already knew what he had to do. The clubhouse was alive with activity. Men worked on bikes in the gravel lot. Women moved through the common areas. The smell of gasoline and engine oil mixed with the scent of barbecue from the grill out back. This was family, chosen family, bound by something deeper than blood. Cole found Taurus, the club president, in the main hall. He was a massive man with a scarred face and eyes that had seen too much, but his loyalty was absolute. Cole had ridden with him for 15 years. "I need the crew." Cole said simply. "Tomorrow morning. All 50. Taurus didn't ask questions. "Where?" "A diner, Route 7, place called Rosie's." "What's the play?" Cole paused. "A man hurt someone yesterday, someone who didn't deserve it. I'm going to make sure he knows that matters." Taurus nodded slowly. He understood the code. The Iron Promise didn't traffic in violence for its own sake. They'd learned that lesson decades ago, but they trafficked in justice, in making sure the invisible was seen, in ensuring that cruelty had consequences. "Tomorrow at dawn?" Taurus asked. "Tomorrow at dawn," Cole confirmed. By midnight, the entire club knew. Messages had been sent. Brothers who rode for other chapters had been contacted. What had started as a single man's need to honor a promise had become something larger, a collective action, a united front. 50 bikers, 1 diner, 1 message. The man in the suit had no idea what was coming. Maya hadn't slept. She'd gone home to her apartment, a small 2-bedroom in a building that smelled like other people's cooking, and had lain in bed next to her son's closed bedroom door, listening to the city outside her window. The man's words kept returning, unemployable, as if he'd reached into her future and decided it for her. She'd worked at Rosie's for 7 years, 7 years of showing up on time, covering shifts when others called out, learning every regular's order by heart. 7 years of building something, even if it wasn't much. Now it was gone. She'd quit before Rosie could fire her. Pride, maybe, or self-preservation. Either way, she was unemployed, and her son's school year was just beginning, and the rent was due in 2 weeks. She'd dressed for a job search. Nice blouse. Professional pants. She'd braided her hair carefully, applied makeup with the precision of someone preparing for battle. By 6 a.m., she was out the door, heading to a nearby diner, a competitor to Rosie's, to see if they were hiring. That's when she heard it. The sound started low and distant, like distant thunder. But it grew, louder, deeper. The sound of motorcycle engines, many of them, in perfect synchronization. Maya stopped walking and turned, the horizon filled with bikes. They came down Route 7, in a line so perfect it looked choreographed. 50 motorcycles, their riders in leather and patches, their engines creating a symphony of power that made the storefronts rattle. They turned onto the street where Rosie's diner sat, and they began to circle the building like a gathering of dark angels. Maya stood frozen on the sidewalk, coffee cup in her shaking hand. The bikers pulled into the parking lot in a coordinated movement, parking their bikes in perfect formation. 50 engines cut out in a cascade of silence. Then as one, they dismounted. 50 men and women, all wearing the same patch on their backs. Iron Promise MC. Cole was first through the door of the diner. He was tall, weathered, with scars on his hands that spoke of a life lived intensely. Behind him came the others, a river of leather and purpose. Rosie, who'd just opened the diner for the morning shift, looked up from the counter and froze. "We heard you serve good coffee," Cole said, his voice steady and calm. 50 of us. We'd like to eat breakfast. And now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. The diner, which had been designed to hold perhaps 60 people comfortably, now contained 110. The 50 bikers, the staff, the handful of early morning regulars, and the owner. Every seat was taken. People stood shoulder to shoulder at the counter, the smell of leather and gasoline mixed with coffee and bacon. Rosie moved through the crowd in a daze, taking orders, her hands shaking slightly. She understood somehow that this wasn't random. She understood that something had shifted. Cole sat in the corner booth, the one where the man in the suit had sat the day before, and ordered the special. Around him, his crew ordered methodically, politely, tipping well on coffee refills. They didn't cause trouble. They didn't raise their voices. They simply existed in the space with a quiet, undeniable presence. Rosie finally approached Cole. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why are you here?" Cole looked at her with eyes that had seen decades compressed into a single moment of clarity. "A man came in yesterday, hurt one of your employees, treated her like she was nothing." Rosie's expression shifted. Understanding, then gratitude, then something like relief. "We're here because she matters," Cole continued. "We're here because people like her. People who work hard, who show up, who do right by others, deserve to know they're seen, that they're valued, that when someone tries to diminish them, there are people who'll stand up." Rosie's eyes watered. Maya quit after that. She was so hurt. Cole nodded. He'd anticipated this. "Where does she live?" By 8 a.m., the bikers still occupied every available space in the diner. Breakfast had turned into a celebration. Rosie refused their money. They left it anyway, in stacks of bills on tables and counters. The local news had arrived, alerted by curious onlookers, and were filming from the parking lot. Cole stepped outside and called a number he'd been given the night before. Maya answered on the third ring, her voice uncertain. "Hello? Your name is Maya Thompson?" Cole asked. "Yes. Who is this?" "My name is Cole. I'm with the Iron Promise MC. I was at your diner yesterday. I saw what that man did to you, and I saw how you handled it. I'm calling because I need you to do me a favor." What? "I need you to come to Rosie's diner, right now. Bring your son if you'd like, but come." Maya hung up the phone, feeling like the world was tilting on its axis. She woke her son Marcus, a 10-year-old, with her eyes and his father's stubbornness, and they drove to the diner in silence. What they found defied explanation. 50 bikers filled the restaurant, and when Maya walked through the door, they stopped talking. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward her. Then, slowly, they began to applaud, not mockingly, not ironically, a genuine, sustained applause that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than sound. Marcus squeezed his mother's hand, confused, but sensing this moment mattered. Cole stood and approached them. "The man who spoke to you yesterday," he said quietly, "owns a chain of restaurants. He's also connected to a network of suppliers who've been underbidding local businesses like Rosie's for years, trying to run them out. What he did to you wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy, making you feel small so you wouldn't think to fight back." "What are you saying?" Maya asked. "I'm saying," Cole replied, "that things are about to change, and I wanted you to see them change." By noon, the story had reached the local news. By 3 p.m., it had gone regional. "Local motorcycle club shows support for waitress mistreated by customer," read the headlines. But Cole and the Iron Promise weren't interested in headlines. They were interested in justice. Within hours, a lawyer, a woman named Sarah Chen, who'd been riding with the MC for 8 years, was pulling records. The man's name was Richard Caldwell. He owned 17 restaurants across 3 states. More importantly, he'd been under investigation twice for wage theft and once for discrimination complaints that had been mysteriously dropped. The Iron Promise didn't break any laws. They simply made sure information reached people who cared about it. Journalists, labor board investigators, employees at Caldwell's other restaurants who suddenly felt emboldened to speak up. By Tuesday of the following week, Caldwell's flagship restaurant had lost its reservation book. His suppliers were reconsidering contracts. 3 of his employees had filed formal complaints about wage violations and hostile work environments. But the real reckoning came when Sarah discovered something deeper. Caldwell had been working with a property development company to acquire commercial real estate at below market value, including the building where Rosie's diner stood. He'd been systematically destroying small business owners, driving down property values, then buying up the land to sell to developers. Rosie's building was worth 3 times what the current owner was asking, but only if someone knew its true value. Cole made sure she got that appraisal. Maya watched it all unfold, like someone witnessing a door open that she'd thought was sealed shut. The man who'd tried to erase her was now being erased himself, not through violence, but through exposure, through the collective weight of doing right. At this point in the story, pause and think about what you'd do. Would you seek revenge, or would you seek justice? These 50 bikers chose the harder path. On Friday evening, Cole stopped by Maya's apartment. She lived in a modest building, but it was clean and safe, and there were drawings on the refrigerator. Marcus's artwork. His dreams rendered in crayon. "I wanted you to know," Cole said, "that your job at Rosie's is waiting. If you want it, she's also raising your wages. The media attention has been good for business." Maya looked at this man, this stranger who decided her life mattered, and something cracked open inside her. "Why?" she asked. "Why do this for someone you don't know?" Cole's expression shifted into something distant and sad. "I had a sister," he said. "She was smart, beautiful. She worked as a nurse. One day, a patient's family member decided she was expendable, decided that her skin color made her less worthy of respect. She internalized it, started believing it. By the time I realized what was happening, she was gone." He paused, swallowing hard. "I made a promise at her grave that I'd never let that happen again, that every time I saw someone being diminished, I'd stand up. I'd make sure they knew they mattered. I'd use whatever resources I had to prove that kindness and justice aren't separate things." Maya understood then. This wasn't about her, or rather it was, but it was also about something universal. About a man trying to redeem a promise he couldn't keep to the sister he'd lost, by keeping it for strangers he'd only just met. 3 weeks after the bikers had filled Rosie's diner, something unexpected happened. Caldwell's flagship restaurant closed. Not due to legal action, the investigations were ongoing, but slow, as investigations often are. It closed because of reputation, because people had learned who he was, and they'd decided their money was better spent elsewhere. The commercial real estate that Caldwell had been trying to acquire suddenly became less attractive to developers. Why invest in gentrification when the community was organizing? When there were 50 bikers and 100 community members who'd remembered what loyalty meant? Maya had returned to Rosie's, and the diner had become something different. It had become a gathering place, not just for the Iron Promise, but for everyone who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or forgotten. Rosie expanded her hours. She hired 2 more waitresses. She started a scholarship fund for local students. Marcus had started wearing a small pin on his backpack, the Iron Promise patch, given to him by Cole. Not as a gang symbol, but as a reminder that there were people in the world who'd chosen to matter. One morning, as Maya was refilling coffee cups, Cole came in alone. He sat in his usual booth. She poured his coffee without being asked, and sat across from him for a moment, something she'd never done before. "The investigation into Caldwell is moving faster," he said. "Sarah found documentation. He's been doing this for 15 years. Other people are coming forward. Employees, business owners, contractors. He's cheated." Maya nodded. She'd been following the news. "It started with you," Cole continued, "with one act of cruelty being witnessed, being named, being refused." "It started with you choosing to see me," Maya corrected. "That's what matters." Cole smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. "There's something else," he said. "Rosie wants to sell the diner to you." Maya felt the world tilt again. "What?" "She's getting older, tired. She wants to step back, travel, spend time with her grandkids. She's asking if you'd consider buying the place. The Iron Promise would help finance it. No loans, no debt, a partnership." Maya's hands shook. A diner, her diner. The place where she'd been mocked and dismissed, now becoming the place where she was owner and decision-maker. "Why?" she asked again, the question she'd been asking since that first morning. "Because you deserve it," Cole said simply, "and because when you own something, nobody can ever make you feel invisible again." Like this story? Comment below. Subscribe for the next chapter of what happens when a community decides to matter. These stories depend on you, on your support, your shares, your belief that justice matters. The wheels were already turning. Caldwell would eventually face multiple lawsuits. Some of his employees would win settlements. The Labor Board investigation would result in significant fines. But more importantly, a pattern of behavior had been exposed and disrupted. Other small business owners started checking their contracts, questioning their dealings with his companies. The man who'd tried to diminish Maya had instead become an example of how a single act of witnessed cruelty could ripple outward, creating change far larger than anyone anticipated. By spring, Maya Thompson owned Rosie's Diner. The sign on the window still read Rosie's. She'd kept the name as a tribute, but it was her establishment now. She'd updated the menu while keeping the classics that regulars loved. She'd hired her best friend Tonya as assistant manager. She'd created a small scholarship fund in honor of Rosie's retirement. The Iron Promise still came by regularly, but now it was different. They came as friends. Cole had become something like a mentor, not a savior, but a guide. He'd introduced Maya to other business owners who'd been harmed by predatory practices like Caldwell's. Together, they'd formed an informal network, sharing information, supporting each other. Marcus had started a new school year with confidence. His mother owned a business. His mother was respected. His mother was seen. One morning, Cole arrived earlier than usual. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of carrying grief. "I'm retiring from the MC," he told Maya, sitting in his booth with his coffee. "Stepping back from the day-to-day. I'm 58 years old, and I've spent the last 37 years riding. It's time to do something different." "What will you do?" Maya asked, genuinely concerned. "I'm thinking about opening a non-profit, working with small businesses that are being targeted by predators, helping them understand their rights, connecting them with resources." He paused. "I was hoping you might want to be on the board, help advise other owners." Maya thought of the man in the suit. She thought of how close she'd come to believing him, to internalizing his cruelty and letting it define her future. She thought of what would have happened if Cole hadn't been in that diner, if he hadn't chosen to turn his grief into action. "Yes," she said, "I'll do it." That afternoon, as the lunch rush began, the diner filled with the familiar sounds and smells. Coffee brewing, bacon sizzling, the chime of the bell above the door as customers arrived. But there was something different now, a sense of possibility, a sense that this place, this small corner of the world, mattered because people had decided it did. Marcus stopped by after school, did his homework in a back booth, and greeted regular customers by name. He'd become part of the fabric of the place. A young woman, nervous, uncertain, came in looking for work. Maya recognized something in her eyes, that invisible feeling, that sense of not mattering. She hired her on the spot, making a promise to herself that she'd help this young woman see her own value before anyone could convince her otherwise. The legal consequences for Richard Caldwell unfolded over the following months like a slow domino effect. The Labour Board investigation concluded with a finding of systematic wage theft. Caldwell was required to pay back wages to 37 current and former employees. The amount totaled $847. 3 separate lawsuits were filed by employees alleging discrimination and hostile work environments. Caldwell's legal team fought each one, but the public record had been established. People knew who he was now. They chose their restaurants accordingly. The property development deal he'd been orchestrating fell through when the developers learned about the community opposition. The land he'd been trying to acquire remained in the hands of small business owners who'd now organized to protect their interests. But the most significant consequence was reputation. In a world where reviews and ratings moved faster than legal process, Caldwell's restaurants became places people avoided. His name, when searched online, was now permanently linked to exploitation and cruelty. Sarah Chen, the lawyer who'd helped uncover the documentation, took on 2 more cases against predatory business practices in the community. The Iron Promise provided financial support for her work. Cole attended one of the legal settlements, watching as a group of Caldwell's former employees received their back pay. The amount was imperfect. It could never fully compensate for the years of underpayment and mistreatment, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was validation. Afterward, Cole stood outside the courthouse, and one of the employees, a young man named David, who'd worked double shifts for Caldwell for 4 years, approached him. "Thank you," David said simply. "I didn't think anyone would care. I thought I was just supposed to accept it." Cole placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "That's what people like Caldwell count on. They count on isolation, on people believing they're alone. But they're not. And now you know that." It was a lesson that would ripple outward, touching people Cole would never meet, inspiring them to stand up, to organize, to refuse diminishment. 6 months after Maya became owner of Rosie's Diner, the Iron Promise organized a community event. They rented a park pavilion on the eastern edge of town, a sprawling green space that overlooked the valley below. The morning had dawned cold and clear, the kind of autumn day where the air itself seemed to hold promise. Cole had spent the previous evening coordinating with Taurus and the rest of the crew, mapping out logistics, making sure everything would be perfect. By noon, the parking lot was full. 50 bikers had arrived first, their motorcycles parked in perfect formation, a testament to discipline and unity, but behind them came others. Employees from Caldwell's restaurants, some of them still processing what it meant to have their exploitation named and challenged. Small business owners who'd been targeted by predatory practices similar to his. Community members who'd simply heard the story and wanted to bear witness. 200 people gathered beneath the pavilion's open structure, where long tables had been arranged with food, grilled chicken, vegetables, fresh bread from a local bakery, run by a woman who'd once worked for Caldwell and had been underpaid for 3 years. The Iron Promise had brought their best, and the smell of charcoal and seasoning drifted across the green. Marcus ran between the tables, helping to set out napkins and cups. At 10 years old, he'd already learned something profound. That community wasn't abstract. It was concrete. It was people showing up. It was tables set with food. It was the willingness to stand alongside someone who'd been knocked down. Maya moved through the crowd, greeting people, introducing them to one another. She'd become someone different in 6 months, not unrecognizable, but transformed. The woman who'd been diminished in a diner now carried herself with a different kind of presence. Not arrogance, clarity. She understood her own value now in a way that couldn't be shaken. Sarah Chen was there with her legal team, discussing cases with interested small business owners. She'd taken on pro bono work, dedicating hours to helping people understand their rights. Her face, which had once been lined with the stress of corporate law, now held something like purpose. She'd spent 15 years making money for large firms. Now, at 53, she was finally doing work that felt meaningful. David, the young man who'd worked double shifts for Caldwell, stood talking with 3 other former employees. They'd become friends through the lawsuit process, bonded by shared experience. David had started taking community college classes. He was thinking about opening his own restaurant someday, one where workers would be treated fairly, where dignity wasn't negotiable. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the pavilion. Cole stood at one end of the space, waiting. People sensed it, a gathered attention, a readiness. Sarah brought him a microphone. The crowd began to settle. Cole looked out at the assembled faces. 50 years old had become visible on his features in a way it hadn't before. But his eyes, those eyes had gained something. Peace. The kind that comes only when a person has transformed their grief into purpose. "Thank you for being here," he began, his voice steady and measured. "I know not all of you know each other. I know not all of you understand exactly why you were invited. So let me start at the beginning." He paused, gathering himself. Behind him, the valley deepened into shadow. 37 years ago, I made a promise," Cole continued. "I made it at my sister's grave. Her name was Rebecca. She was a nurse, smart, beautiful, dedicated to caring for people. One day, a patient's family member decided that her skin color made her less worthy of basic respect. They complained about her, complained loudly, complained systemically. Cole's voice didn't waver, but something in his jaw tightened. Rebecca internalized that message, started believing it. She began to think the world was right, that she was less than. Within 2 years, she was gone. Suicide, 28 years old. The crowd was silent. Even the evening birds seemed to quiet. I stood at her grave and I promised her that I would never let that happen again, that every time I saw someone being diminished, being erased, being told they didn't matter, I would stand up. I would make sure they knew the truth, that they mattered, that their dignity mattered, that the world is better because they exist in it. Cole looked directly at Maya. 6 months ago, I witnessed something in a small diner. A man decided that a woman didn't matter. He mocked her. He humiliated her. He tried to make her believe she was disposable. And I watched her absorb that cruelty with grace, but I also watched it break something inside her. Maya's eyes glistened, though she didn't look away. So I called my brothers. I called my sisters in the Iron Promise, and I said, "We need to go stand with her. Not to cause trouble, not to be violent, but to witness, to say, 'We see you. You matter.' And anyone who tries to diminish you will find that there are people who've decided your dignity is worth fighting for." Cole gestured toward the crowd. What we didn't anticipate was what would happen next. We didn't know that standing with Maya would expose a much larger pattern. We didn't know that one act of cruelty witnessed would unravel years of systematic exploitation. We didn't know that a man who'd been operating predatory practices for 15 years would finally face consequences. He paused, letting that sink in. But more importantly, Cole continued, we didn't know that this moment would inspire something in all of you, that you would find your own courage, that you would decide that invisibility was no longer acceptable. David stepped forward, and Cole gestured for him to speak. "I worked for Richard Caldwell for 4 years, David said, his voice still carrying traces of uncertainty, but also something new, agency. "I worked double shifts. I made less than minimum wage when you factored in the hours. I thought it was normal. I thought it was just how things were. But then these people showed up, and they said, 'No, this isn't okay. You matter enough to fight for.'" David's hands shook slightly as he held the microphone. "I'm taking legal action now. Sarah's helping me. And I'm going to win. But more than that, I'm learning that I don't have to accept exploitation. I'm learning that there are people who believe in justice, real justice, not just legal justice, but moral justice." Sarah took the microphone next. She was a woman who'd spent her career in corporate law, and her voice carried the precision of someone accustomed to courtrooms and careful language. "In 30 years of practicing law," she said, "I've learned that the system is often rigged, that people with power use it to maintain that power, that the invisible people, the workers, the immigrants, the marginalized, are often treated as acceptable losses in the pursuit of profit." She looked at Cole, then at Maya, then back at the crowd. "But I've also learned that systems can be disrupted, that documentation can be uncovered, that when a community decides something is wrong, legal mechanisms can be activated to address it. Richard Caldwell is currently facing multiple lawsuits. He owes nearly $1 million in back wages. His reputation has been destroyed, not by violence, but by truth, by exposure, by community action." Sarah's voice strengthened. "And that's the most powerful thing I've witnessed in my career. Not the legal victory, though that matters, but the fact that a community decided together that exploitation was unacceptable. That's what changes systems." As evening deepened, Cole called Maya to the center of the pavilion. She stood beside him, and Marcus joined them, this small family that had been forged through crisis. "6 months ago," Cole said, "this woman was fired from a job she'd held for 7 years. Today, she owns the business. She's not just an employee anymore. She's a decision maker. She's an employer. She's someone with power. And she's using that power to make sure other people who've been marginalized, dismissed, overlooked, have opportunity. Cole turned to face Maya directly. "I came to this diner as a stranger," he said. "I came because my bike had engine trouble. I came because I was looking for a place to sit with my grief for a few hours. But what I found was a reason to transform that grief into action. What I found was someone worth standing for. What I found was a moment that changed everything." Maya reached out and took Cole's hand. The gesture was simple, but it held weight. It said, "I see you. I understand what you've sacrificed. I honor what you've built." "There's something else," Cole continued, addressing the crowd again. "I've been thinking about what comes next. I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations with the iron promise. I'm launching a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting small businesses that are being targeted by predatory practices. The organization will offer legal support, business consultation, community connections, everything we wish had existed when we first encountered these problems." He paused, and his voice grew stronger. "And I'm asking Maya Thompson to be the co-director. Not as someone being rescued, but as someone who understands the problem intimately, as someone who's lived it and overcome it." Maya nodded, tears now flowing freely, though her expression remained composed. "Together," Cole said, "we're going to make sure that the invisible people become visible, that exploitation becomes unacceptable, that communities organize to protect their own, not through violence but through justice. Real justice, moral justice." As darkness settled completely, someone started a bonfire. The flames grew, casting dancing shadows across the pavilion. The crowd naturally began to gather closer, finding warmth and connection in the gathering dusk. Marcus sat between Cole and Maya, his small frame dwarfed by their presence, but secure between them. He understood, on some level beyond words, that he was witnessing something significant, that his mother's story had become a story belonging to everyone present. David approached Cole with two other former Caldwell employees. They'd been talking quietly, and now they came with a question. Would the non-profit help them open a cooperative restaurant? A place where workers owned shares, where decisions were made collectively, where dignity was fundamental to the business model. Cole didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly what we should be doing." By the time the gathering ended, after midnight, plans had been made. Sarah had identified 3 other businesses operating under predatory models. David and his colleagues were preparing their business proposal. Local media had covered the event, and the story had spread, not as sensationalism, but as documentation of community organizing. As people departed, motorcycles roaring to life, car engines starting, the pavilion being cleared by volunteers, Cole and Maya lingered. Marcus was asleep against Cole's shoulder, and they stood quietly, watching the embers of the fire glow in the darkness. "I keep thinking," Maya said softly, "about what would have happened if you hadn't been in that diner, if your bike hadn't needed repair, if you'd decided to go somewhere else." Cole looked at her, and in the firelight, his face was visible in all its weathered complexity, the lines of grief and loss, but also the lines of purpose and transformation. "I think," he said carefully, "that sometimes the world arranges things exactly as they need to be arranged, that sometimes a person carries grief for so long that they become a vessel for justice, that sometimes a stranger walks into a diner at exactly the moment when someone needs to be witnessed." He paused, shifting slightly so as not to disturb Marcus. "But I also think," Cole continued, "that what happens next is up to us, that we get to decide whether this moment becomes a story or a movement, whether we let it fade or whether we build something real from it." Maya thought of her apartment, her son's future, the diner that now belonged to her. She thought of David and the other employees finding their voices, She thought of Sarah dedicating her legal expertise to justice. She thought of the iron promise, choosing to stand against cruelty. "I want to build something real," Maya said. "I want to make sure that what happened to me, what happened to all of us, doesn't happen to anyone else." Cole smiled, that rare expression that transformed his weathered face into something almost boyish, almost hopeful. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. They stood together as the fire died to embers, as the night deepened around them, as the valley below disappeared into darkness. But above them, stars began to emerge, thousands of them, visible only when the human-made light faded away. In that darkness, beneath those stars, a promise was being made, not the promise Cole had made at his sister's grave all those years ago, though it honored that promise. This was a different promise, a collective one, shared among strangers who'd become community. A promise that invisibility would no longer be acceptable, that cruelty would have consequences, that the people society had decided didn't matter would be seen, valued, protected. It was a promise that would ripple outward in ways none of them could yet anticipate. It would change lives. It would inspire other communities to organize. It would become a model for how people could stand together against exploitation. But on this night, in this quiet moment after the gathering had ended, it was simply a promise between three people. A man carrying grief, transformed into purpose, a woman who'd learned her own value, and a child who would grow up knowing that the world was capable of both cruelty and extraordinary kindness. The fire faded to ash. The stars burned constant above them, and the future, though uncertain, suddenly felt possible.